When you're a child, the idea of being babysat can be frightening. To tell you the truth, I always considered myself very brave and didn't feel that I needed one. But anyway, my parents told me they were going to hire the best babysitter in the area, just in case. At the time, I thought for sure it would be fine. I had no idea that the person in front of me was Christine Falling, a name that seemed irrelevant at the time, but would mark me for the rest of my life. Christine had a strange smile, as if there was something she didn't want to tell us. She had never taken care of me, but for some reason, my parents adored her. They said she was charming and responsible. I didn't understand why there was so much expectation of her, but I still felt something was wrong with her smile. Until then, my parents took turns taking care of me, but my mother had to take overtime, so they needed someone to take care of me urgently. The first afternoon with Christine was awkward. She moved around the house as if she were inspecting every nook and cranny, but with an eerie calmness. Every time I spoke to her, she would look me in the eye and then look away as if ignoring me. As the days passed, my parents continued to notice nothing strange. I, on the other hand, was increasingly afraid of being alone with her. Something about Christine just didn't add up. It was as if she hated me, but did nothing to show it. I didn't know what to do or who to turn to. I felt like no one would believe me. One afternoon after I finished my homework, I decided to talk to Christine. I wanted to know more about her. My mom used to tell me that if I didn't get along with someone, I should talk about it. So I did. We were in the living room. I was sitting on the couch, and she was sitting on a chair in front of me, with that eternal and disturbing smile.
Do you have a family, Christine?
Yes, I do have a family. And they are with me now.
What do you mean?
That my family is inside me, little one. My family talks to me in my head. You want to know what they tell me?
What do they tell you?
They tell me they hate you. They hate that you're a little brat with a happy and wealthy family. They tell me they want to kill you in your sleep. You know what else they say?
I don't want to talk anymore. I'm afraid.
Exactly. They say you should be afraid. That if you talk about this to anyone, no one will believe you. And you know what will happen next? Then I'll come at night and kill your whole family. Then I'll come at night and kill your whole family. Do you understand? Do you understand?
Yes.
After that conversation, she simply patted me on the head and left, laughing amicably. When my parents arrived, I kept quiet, terrified of what would happen to me, but also of what would happen to them if I dared to talk. The next day after school, Christine told me it was time to take a bath. I felt a knot in my stomach. I didn't want to leave her alone in the house, but I had no choice. I went into the bathroom, closed the door, and turned on the faucet, taking advantage of the moment when I was away from her. As the water was running, I couldn't stop listening to her. She was talking to someone. There was something very wrong with her, something I couldn't define. She was talking to herself. Every minute I spent in the shower, I felt the fear growing in my chest. Finally, I wrapped myself in a towel and stepped out of the bathroom. I walked towards my room, and as I passed by the living room, I saw her. She was standing, staring blankly into the void, moving her lips without a sound.
Bedtime, boy.
Terrified, not knowing what to do, I listened to her. That night, I pretended to sleep while listening to her whispers coming from the living room. She was still talking to herself. My heart was pounding as I tried to understand what she was saying. The words kill and necessary stood out in the murmur. I froze in bed, praying that my parents would return soon. When the whispers became more intense, I knew something was going to happen. I heard her say, "Yes, yes, I will soon, but not now, not now." My mind was blank with sheer terror. Who was she talking to? What was she planning? Suddenly, the whispering stopped, and all was silent. I dared to open one eye and look towards the door. I saw her, standing there, watching me with a huge smile behind the half-open door. I tried to remain calm and kept pretending to sleep. My body tensed and I closed my eyes tightly, trying to maintain regular breathing. The door creaked open slowly, and I felt her presence on the threshold.
It's time. It's now or never.
Her footsteps approached my bed, and I could feel her breath on my face.
Wake up.
I didn't move. Suddenly, I felt her hands on my neck, squeezing. My eyes snapped open and I saw her face distorted by a mixture of fury and fear. I tried to scream, but her grip was too strong. My hands moved frantically, trying to free myself, but she wouldn't budge. The air began to go out of me, and my vision blurred. Just when I thought it would be over, something changed in her expression. Her hands trembled, and her grip loosened.
No, I'm not ready. Not yet.
She had gone mad, backing up and down. I stayed on the bed, breathing hard as she staggered toward the door, shouting in different voices. Suddenly, Christine recoiled, looking at her hands as if they were alien to her. Her eyes filled with terror, and she began to mutter again. This time, the words were clearer.
I can't do this.
I took the moment to roll off the bed and hide under it, trying to catch my breath. I watched her from my hiding place, rocking back and forth, bumping into everything. My heart was pounding, and I felt like I could explode at any moment. Suddenly, she ran at me and tried to pull me out from under the bed. Her hands were desperately reaching for me as if she had to, as if she had no choice. As she tried to reach me, she swiped at me with her nails, trying to hurt me in any way she could, even if it was just by scratching me. I pulled away as far as I could, but somehow she managed to reach my foot and drag me from under the bed. In an act of desperation, she grabbed my little head and lifted it up with both hands, shaking it back and forth. She began to squeeze it tighter and tighter until I thought she was going to pop it. But in a second, she threw me against the wall.
Ah!
Her voice was now broken and full of desperation. She was clutching her head, pulling at her hair, and her body was shaking uncontrollably. I went back to hiding. I knew it was no use, that she already knew where I was. But I could do nothing else, not daring to move. Finally, she ran out of the room, and I heard the front door slam shut. I stayed under the bed, shaking and crying, unable to believe what had just happened to me. I didn't know how long it had been, but I finally mustered the courage to come out of hiding and run to the phone. I dialed my parents' number with trembling hands. I told them what had happened, even though I knew it would sound crazy. They came home quickly, alarmed by my condition. I explained everything in more detail, and although they didn't seem to believe me at first, the desperation in my voice convinced them. They called the police, but Christine was already gone. The officers searched the house but found no trace of her. This seemed to have convinced them that my story was real, since the Christine they knew would never have left me alone with bruises on my neck and head. Years passed and I grew up, moved out, and built a life of my own, but the trauma of that night remained etched in my mind. I never knew what became of Christine Falling, until one day, while watching the news, her face appeared on the screen. She was being arrested for a series of murders. I recognized her instantly, even though her appearance had changed over the years. I felt a mixture of fear and relief. That night, I hadn't died by a miracle. Maybe she wasn't yet demented enough to kill me. But after a while, she was. Sometimes, I see my children in the room and think of her. I think that there are many other Christines ready to hurt my children, but I will not allow it. I will always protect them, no matter what. This story is inspired by the crimes of Christine Falling, also known as the Killer Nanny, an American serial killer responsible for the deaths of several children in her care. Born on March 12, 1963, Falling began her terrifying crime spree at a young age. Between 1980 and 1982, while working as a nanny, Falling used her position of trust to carry out a series of murders, suffocating 5 children and an elderly man. Her crimes were initially difficult to detect due to a lack of evidence and the seemingly inexplicable nature of the deaths. However, suspicions began to arise when the pattern of unusual deaths surrounding Falling became too obvious to ignore. Eventually, Falling confessed to her crimes and was arrested in 1982. She was sentenced to life in prison for her murders. When captured, she said she heard voices in her head saying, "Murder, kill, murder," over and over again.
Many say that people don't find their vocation until they grow up. My case is totally different. Babysitting has always been my favorite job. That's how I met the Harpers, a nice family with 2 children, Emily and Joshua. When I first arrived at their home, I was greeted with smiles and a warm welcome. The parents, Sarah and Mark, seemed like normal, friendly people. The house was spacious and well kept. They made me feel quite comfortable, and I felt that my job was going to be quite easy. Emily and Joshua were quiet kids. I'm not going to lie to you, they behaved strangely at times, but not in a way that worried me too much. They're kids, and kids sometimes do weird things. 8-year-old Emily was very protective of her younger brother Joshua, who was 6. We spent our afternoons playing board games, watching movies, and doing crafts. Gradually, I gained the parents' trust and became the children's primary babysitter. With each visit, I became more comfortable in the Harper home. Sarah and Mark always paid me on time and treated me with respect. The kids were still a little strange, but they were good kids. They never gave me any serious trouble, and over time I even began to feel like I was part of the family, like I was a big sister to Emily and Joshua. One night, Sarah and Mark had an important dinner and asked me to watch the kids until late. I accepted without a second thought. I arrived early, and Sarah showed me the new security system they had installed, which seemed a bit excessive, but I didn't say anything. We just want to be safe, she told me with a friendly smile, as if laughing at how over-the-top her husband was. I didn't think much of it and concentrated on the kids. The evening passed normally. We had pizza for dinner, played a few games, and then I put them to bed. After making sure they were asleep, I settled down on the couch in the living room to watch TV. I fell asleep without realizing it. I knew I didn't have to, but the kids weren't going to cause any trouble. Suddenly, a sound woke me up. I woke up with a start. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning, and everything was quiet except for a faint scream coming from somewhere in the house. My heart began to pound. I thought I was dreaming, but the scream was repeated, this time clearer and full of desperation. I quickly got up from the couch. Something was happening to the boys. I ran upstairs and checked that Emily and Joshua were safely in their beds. So whose scream was that? I could swear it was coming from inside the house. At that moment, I heard it again, clearer than before. Was there someone else inside the house? The scream was faint, but I could follow it, and doing so led me to the attic. I stood in front of the hatch that opened the attic, but something behind me tugged at my shirt. It was the children. It was Emily, but something was wrong with her.
Don't go to the attic. Please, don't go.
She was absolutely terrified. Her eyes were watery. Next to her, Joshua looked at me timidly, and he just nodded, his little body shaking. I ignored his warning and continued with what I was doing. If there was a child nearby, I had to help him. I opened the attic door and climbed the stairs slowly. The attic was dark. a place I had never visited before. I groped for the light switch, feeling the cold, damp air around me. Finally, I found the switch and turned on the light. What I saw took my breath away, totally frozen in terror at the image before me. There was a chained child, dirty and hurt, crying in a corner. Emily and Joshua followed me into the attic, their faces full of horror and sadness.
You shouldn't have found him.
Suddenly, I heard a mechanical noise near me. I looked up and noticed a camera on the ceiling pointing at us. The children looked at it in terror and began to apologize, saying that they had nothing to do with what was happening. After a few moments of terrified silence, I approached the chained boy. He was terrified of me. He could barely see me. This boy had been in the dark for a long time.
What is your name?
The boy just cried, not daring to speak. Emily and Joshua were still standing, watching us with a mixture of horror and sadness.
Who did this to you? What is going on here? Do you know what's going on?
Emily and Joshua exchanged nervous glances before Emily finally spoke.
We can't say anything. If we do, we will also be punished and end up here.
At that moment, I felt a knot in my stomach as I realized that these children were in danger. They were terrified of their own parents.
Calm down. I'm going to get this kid out of here, and then we'll call the police. Okay?
They just nodded, too scared to talk. Quickly, I looked for something to break the boy's chains, finding a toolbox in the corner of the attic. I freed the boy as fast as I could, my hands shaking with adrenaline and fear. With the child free, we climbed down the attic as quietly as possible. Once downstairs, I called the police and explained the situation. They assured me they would send a patrol car right away. The children were terrified, but I tried to remain calm so as not to scare them anymore.
Everything will be all right, children. Now we have to get out of here, okay?
Then I heard the sound of the front door opening. The children's parents had arrived home much faster than I thought.
Quick, let's hide.
I frantically led the children to a closet in the living room. The chained child, Emily, Joshua, and I huddled together, waiting for the police to arrive. It wasn't long before we heard the heavy footsteps of Sarah and Mark approaching.
Where are the kids? Where the hell did you hide the kids?
Mark's voice was full of fury. Sarah followed close behind him, just as angry as he was. I knew that if they found us, I would be dead. I tried to stay calm and whispered to the children not to make any noise. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and the closet we were hiding in seemed to shrink with each passing second. I stood still and took a deep breath. Never in my life had I been as afraid as I was that night. The man was getting closer and closer. I knew he was going to find me. I closed my eyes in terror, waiting for it all to pass. Suddenly, the closet door burst open. Sarah grabbed me by the hair and dragged me out, while Mark held the children, keeping them out of the way.
You backstabbing little girl. Why are you doing this? Why are you ruining everything?
I tried to break free, but Sarah's strength was amazing. She dragged me to the center of the room and began to kick me brutally.
Please don't!
I begged her not to hurt me, but my pleas only seemed to make her angrier. In the midst of the chaos, I saw Emily and Joshua looking on in terror, not knowing what to do. Suddenly, the chained boy lunged toward Sarah, crying and screaming, but fell before he reached the woman. This boy had no strength. He could barely keep his balance. Sarah rushed towards him to attack him, but before she could do so, Emily attacked her with a vase and hurt her head. Sarah was enraged. Emily started to run while her mother chased after her, while Mark kept an eye on me and checked on the other children. Mark turned to me. He was not happy.
This is your fault!
Furious, he lifted the TV with both hands. I was still in pain. I couldn't get up. The man was about to throw it at my head. He was going to murder me. The children were hitting his legs, but they didn't seem to do anything to him. Suddenly, a flash of blue light filled the room. I looked toward the door and saw the police, guns in hand, pointing directly at Mark. Sarah was next to them in custody while another of the cops hugged Emily. Mark dropped the TV and slowly raised his hands. The cops moved quickly, handcuffing Mark and Sarah. I still remember how the children looked at me, crying. They were scared but happy. Emily, on the other hand, looked very sad. She came up to me and looked at me shyly.
Why did Mom and Dad do this? Do they hate us?
I didn't have an answer for her. I could only hug her and assure her that it was all over. They took us to the hospital to check our wounds. At the hospital, the doctors were quick to treat us. I had some bruises and cuts, but nothing serious. Emily and Joshua were fine, and although the chain boy arrived in critical condition, they were able to save him. Mark and Sarah are currently in court, but things are not looking good for them. They lost custody of their children, and today they live with their aunt, who knew nothing of what was going on. Sometimes I go to visit them, and they seem much happier. They treated me as their big sister, and I promised that they would never go through anything like what they went through again. After all they went through, these kids can finally be kids.
Hey, my name is Trish. I'm one of those babysitters that, although I'm good with kids, have a hard time interacting with other adults and making myself known as a babysitter. Luckily, I recently found out that Craigslist also offers services. It's not just a portal to buy and sell things. Using Craigslist, I got several babysitting jobs, and for the first time in my 18 years of life, I started earning money. But this little job didn't last long, as something forced me to interrupt it. At first, it seemed like a normal job with just a little quirk. A single father had hired me to babysit his son. Normally, parents wait for me to arrive before they leave so they can meet me, or at least see my face. But not this one. When I arrived at the house, there was no one there. Just a little boy who came to greet me with a big hug and lots of kisses on my face. It seemed too euphoric, but at the same time, a little tender. As the afternoon progressed, everything became stranger. Although he was a big boy about 10 years old, he needed my help with almost everything. He would ask me to help him to eat, to stroke his head, to take off his clothes because the room was too warm. I was surprised that a child of that age required so much attention. Possibly that's how the father had raised him. After eating, it was time to go to sleep, but the father had written that he could eat ice cream. The child not only ate it in a disgusting and repulsive way, putting it in his mouth with his hands and dirtying everything, but to make matters worse, he would put his hands with ice cream in my mouth for me to taste. If I refused, he would cry and make a lot of noise until I finally gave in. After that, I began to smell a very strange but familiar smell. That's when I realized that the boy hadn't made it to the bathroom. So not only did he make me clean his clothes, but I had to clean him as well. After that, the time finally came. He was finally going to take a bath and then go to sleep. I took off all his clothes, although for some reason he was too shy to take off his underwear, but I accepted it. In the worst case scenario, I could wash him later. During a shower, the boy asked me to soap him, to wash him, and he even threw water on my top. It was all very uncomfortable. I had never dealt with anyone like this before. It only made me wonder who was the strange man who had raised him. The only thing I knew was that I didn't want to be there when he arrived. I grabbed all of the boy's clothes and went to his room to get a towel, until a smell I didn't recognize this time made me go look under the bed. When I did, I couldn't help but scream in terror. Under the bed was a corpse. It was still fresh. What could have caused this? Suddenly, a phone started ringing from the dining room, and I ran over. Maybe it was the boy's father. I had to tell him to call the police. The killer might still be nearby. I had to take the boy away as soon as possible. I ran downstairs, but the noise of the phone came from a cell phone that was under an armchair. When I bent down to grab it, I not only had the phone in my hands, but something else. It was an ID card of a man over 30 years old. I knew that face. It was the face of the child I was taking care of. That wasn't a child. That was a grown man. Suddenly, I heard a scream at the top of the stairs. It was him, looking at me, while laughing with a face full of perversion and cruelty. He knew I had found out the truth.
Hey, Trish. I've had my bath. Will you tell me a bedtime story?
In shock, I ran for the exit while he was still laughing. He never tried to chase me. He never tried to kill me. He just enjoyed seeing me terrified, crying, and trying to get away. I called the police immediately. Although they found no one, they discovered that the body belonged to a man who lived alone in the house and had no children. I never heard from that terrifying psychopath again. From that day on, I was able to overcome my fears and start working with people in my neighborhood, people I knew. Every time I think about how that man took advantage of me and made me do all those things I did, I cry. I just cry myself to sleep and forget about it. I rang the bell twice and waited for someone to answer the door. I was standing in the front porch of the Parsons family home. They were relatively new to the neighborhood and had moved into the locality only 2 months back. They looked friendly enough during my brief interactions with them and came across as generally nice people. You know, the typical suburban American family. So I was not surprised when Mrs. Parsons reached out to me and inquired if I would be willing to babysit her son for an evening. They were offering $100 for it. That is good money for a 15-year-old in my neck of the woods, so it didn't take me long to say yes. Although I did hear from somewhere that the boy was a bit of a problem child, and I had never babysat any male kid before. Come on, he's just a little kid. How hard could it be? I thought to myself. Well, I was going to find out soon anyway. The door opened and I was greeted by Mr. and Mrs. Parsons. They invited me into their home and introduced me to their 8-year-old son, Jimmy. Hi, Jimmy. I'm Kathy. Nice to meet you, I said as I shook his hand. He smiled sheepishly at me and then went back and sat on his sofa. He started playing a game in his video game console. Mrs. Parsons then told me that she and her husband would be attending a concert in the evening. She promised that they would be back by 10 p.m. and her husband would drop me home when they got back. She had already cooked for Jimmy and asked me to reheat it in the microwave before giving it to him. She also gave me an allowance and asked me to order whatever I wanted from the local restaurant. Before leaving, Mr. Parsons turned back to look at his son and said,
Listen, Jimmy, you're going to behave yourself, okay? When we get back, we expect Kathy to only say nice things about you. You got it?
He asked. Jimmy nodded and went back to his game as the Parsons bid goodbye, and they left for the concert. Things were quiet for the next 20 minutes. Jimmy continued to play his game while I ruffled through a magazine and was simultaneously chatting with friends on my phone. I kept occasionally glancing at Jimmy to keep an eye on him. He was well behaved thus far and kept to himself. A few more minutes went by. Then I heard a small thud. Jimmy just casually threw his console away on the floor. Then he placed his legs on the table in front of him and sat back in his sofa with his hands resting behind his head and fingers interlocked. He was looking at me. I'm bored, he said. I smiled at him and closed my magazine. Would you like to watch some TV? Is there any cartoon or anime that is your favorite? I asked. He just kept staring at me while twirling his toes. Dance for me, he said. Excuse me? I replied, totally taken aback. Dance, sing, do whatever you want. Mom and Dad are paying you to be here, right? So go ahead, entertain me, he said. You arrogant little twerp. Who do you think you are? I thought to myself. But I couldn't speak to him like that. He's still just a kid. Jimmy, didn't your parents teach you to be respectful of elders? I don't appreciate the way you've been talking to me, I said. I then continued. Now, if you're bored, I can switch on the TV or read a story from a favorite book of your choice. Boring, he said immediately, looking away. What would you like to do? Are you hungry? Shall I heat and give you the food your mom prepared for you? I asked. He turned to look at me and asked, Do you have a boyfriend? No, I replied back before I could even help myself. He smirked. Ha! I thought as much, he said. For the first time, my face was flushed with anger, and I was trying hard to compose myself. I was letting this kid get to me. Jimmy then got up from his chair and said, On second thoughts, I am hungry. Let's order pizza. He took the cordless phone and began to dial. I got up, walked towards him, and removed the phone from his hand. Your mother gave strict instructions not to order out. You'll have to eat what she made for you, I said. No, I won't, and you can't force me, he retorted. He looked ready to throw a fit. I took up my phone and told him, I am going to call your dad now. Your parents are not going to be happy to hear what I have to say. The stern warning was working. Jimmy realized the consequences of what would follow and finally said, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done that. It's all right, Jimmy. Now what would you like to eat? Are you hungry? I asked him. The little boy thought for a moment and then asked, Is it okay if I can hug you? Please, he said, smiling sweetly with folded hands. I smiled and nodded. The boy came forward and gave me a warm hug. And then I suddenly felt a searing pain in my body. Jimmy bit me in the arm and quickly moved back. As I stood there rubbing my arm in shock, he came towards me again and this time grabbed my phone. He ran towards the window and threw it out. Jimmy! I yelled in anger. I opened the front door and peered outside. The phone landed in the garden, which was populated with all kinds of plants and shrubs. The place was also poorly lit. I turned back to him angrily. You better stay put in your place, or else you will really be sorry, I warned him. He took the hint and sat back on his chair. I then went out to search for my phone. I was crouched on all fours, combing the place with my hands in all that darkness, hoping I would somehow find it. A few minutes passed by and then I heard the door slam shut. I started panicking and rushed back towards the door. As I got closer to the entrance, I heard a loud noise. It was not Jimmy's. It sounded like a much older man. He was inside the house with Jimmy and was yelling at the top of his voice.
Where's the money, boy? Where's your father kept it?
He roared.
Shut up! Stop crying! I'm going to smack you if you don't stop now!
He roared. I could hear Jimmy crying, and I began to panic. I started banging on the door. I was really worried about the boy's safety. Please, I don't know anything about that, I heard Jimmy reply back. Then I heard something crash to the floor, accompanied by the sounds of running footsteps from inside the house. Jimmy was shouting, Help! Somebody please help me! Please, no! Leave me! Please! Ah! Jimmy was screaming at the top of his lungs. Now even I started yelling from outside while continuing to bang on the door. Jimmy! Jimmy! I cried. Things suddenly went quiet, but it was only for a fleeting moment, and then I heard another crash at the back of the house. I ran back to see what happened. The back door was left open. I slowly tiptoed towards the door and peered inside. I couldn't find anybody. I then rushed indoors towards the living room. I saw Jimmy lying on the floor, face down, in a pool of his own blood. I ran towards the boy in absolute panic and turned him over. I couldn't even figure out if he was dead or unconscious. I couldn't even check his pulse because my hands were trembling. I got up to get the phone. I dialed the number to call an ambulance. And then I heard that voice again, this time from behind me.
I'm going to kill you!
He roared. I turned back in absolute horror, thinking this was going to be the end of me. I realized I was looking at a giant TV screen with a picture of an angry man on it. Then the picture came to life. The man on the screen started yelling again. Pause. He froze. Play.
I'm coming for you,
he said. Pause. He froze again. With the phone still held to my ear, I slowly turned around to look where I found Jimmy lying on the floor. He was sitting upright on his knees, with a TV remote in his hand, and an evil grin on his face. The obnoxious brat had been playing me all along. Everything was fake. The attack, the cries for help, the blood on his t-shirt, it was all fake. Why would you do this to me? I asked him, unable to hide my helplessness. Well, I saw the film Home Alone with my parents last month. I've been simply wanting to try this since then, he answered back. I was fighting back tears that were welling up inside me, but I didn't want to give this kid the satisfaction of seeing me break down. The last thing I needed right now was him to start calling me a crybaby. Deep down, I really, really wanted to spank that brat. Then, I heard a knock on the door.
Mr. Parsons, is everything okay?
I heard a voice from the outside.
This is Dominique, your neighbor. We heard screams from your home.
He said.
Is everything all right?
He asked as he continued to knock on the door. I finally felt a tinge of relief. I have known Uncle Dominic since I was a kid, and he was a kind man. I walked towards the door and opened it. He was standing with 3 other people. All were looking concerned.
Kathy, what are you doing here? What is going on?
He asked. Before I could reply, I saw his expression change from confusion to alarm. He just barged into the living room. When I turned back, I saw Jimmy slumped on the sofa, unconscious, with bloodstains all over his shirt. Dominique urgently patted him on the cheek, and he remained unresponsive. He then sprinkled some water on his face, and the boy started slowly to regain consciousness. I stood there, awestruck, watching the drama continue to unfold in front of me. Where am I? Jimmy asked, trying to look all groggy and confused.
You're at home, my child. Are you okay? What happened?
Dominique asked, pointing to his clothes. I stepped forward to answer. Uncle Dominique, it's all fine. He is just acting. Dominique raised his hand and gestured to me to keep quiet. He then asked another neighbor to fetch a doctor who lived 2 houses away. Then the screaming started again. She is a monster! Jimmy yelled out with his finger pointed at me. Keep her away from me, please! Please, please, sir! He cried with his eyes closed heavily, leaning into Uncle Dominique as if requiring his protection. All of them were staring at me now. I could no longer control my tears. They were just flowing down my face. It was bad enough to be treated shabbily by this kid in private. But now, people who I grew up knowing my entire life were giving me looks like I was some kind of tyrant. I just wanted to get back home and hug my parents. I couldn't take this any longer. I ran towards the entrance and threw the front door wide open and was shocked to see a policeman standing in front of me. Did the neighbors complain? Am I going to be arrested? I thought to myself as I struggled to control my pounding heart.
Is this the Parsons home?
He asked me. I nodded.
Are you the babysitter, Kathy?
He continued. I nodded again.
Where is Jimmy?
He then asked. I pointed my finger at a future Oscar winner. For the first time, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. The little rascal finally realized he had gone too far. I quickly explained to the officer what happened, and it didn't take him long to believe me. The little twerp couldn't even look him in the eye. The officer then told me.
You both are coming with me to the station.
Before I could put in another word, a couple of constables escorted me and Jimmy into the police car. Why am I being taken to the station, officer? I haven't done anything wrong, I protested, but I was met with all-around silence. When we reached the place, I saw Mr. and Mrs. Parsons in the station as well. I was shocked to see them locked behind bars. They also looked oddly dressed in full black gear, very different from the classy attire they had worn for the concert. Then, on the table, I saw a shotgun and other semi-automatic weapons wrapped in evidence bags. The realization began to finally dawn on me. These people were some kind of criminals. The officer walked up to me and said,
Mr. and Mrs. Parson have been arrested for trying to rob a diamond merchant. They shot and injured people during the heist, so they will be going to prison for a long time.
He asked. I nodded my head. I looked at Jimmy. He had been seated on a bench across the other end of the hall. He was staring into an abyss and looked lost in his own thoughts. I could see that he was trying to grapple with the consequences of what was about to come. His life was going to change completely from now on. I sat next to him on the bench and gently wrapped my arms around him. He hugged me back and started crying inconsolably.